On behalf of the Northern Ireland Science Festival, we'd like to welcome back Adam Hart. Adam will be chatting to us this evening about his latest publication, Unfit for Purpose. A special thanks goes to Emer Maguire, who will be chairing the event for us this evening. If you like what you see, please hit the subscribe button below. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Emer Maguire and I'm chairing today's Northern Ireland Science Festival event. I'm a science communicator and a radio presenter, and I am a massive science fan, particularly science books. Northern Ireland Science Festival is in its 7th year now and has quickly become one of the biggest and largest celebrations of STEM in Europe, which is just incredible. With over 120 events over 14 days, the festival showcases the best of local and international science and innovation to a worldwide audience. And today's event is a very special event. It's an interview with Professor Adam Hart, biologist, broadcaster and author, and more recently, writer of the fantastic book, Unfit for Purpose. So I want to say a big welcome to Adam.
Thank you.
Adam, before we kick off, I just want to say the book is fantastic and I loved it, absolutely adored it. My background with my master's at least is in evolution, so it was just right up my street. And I've no doubt as I'm chatting to you, people will be thinking, where can we get the book? Where can we read it? And Unfit for Purpose is going to be available at the festival's official bookseller for anyone in Belfast. That is No Alibis Bookshop. So the link is going to be in the chat box of this event. Obviously, if you're not in Belfast, you can support your local independent bookshops, and you can also get involved throughout with Science Festival at NISciFest and with our hashtag NISF21. So Adam, I wanted to kick off. Thank you for being here, but I wanted to cover so many things. It was such a great book. It was packed full. But before we kick off with that, let's just start with you. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and even give us a quick overview of what the book is about.
Yeah, sure. I'm actually an entomologist by sort of persuasion, really. Although recently, quite a lot of my research work is involved with sort of African conservation issues. So I'm kind of I get bored quite easily, I guess is one way to sum it up. And I'm interested in science in the round and so many different types of topics. So yeah, my background really is sort of biology, evolutionary biology, zoology, that sort of thing. And you know, this book came about really from an interesting progression. I did a program for Radio 4 about 6 years ago now, I think, on gut bacteria, and that really grabbed me. How just how vital gut bacteria are, all these connections that you could make, and as a platform for just explaining some of the most incredible sort of scientific breakthroughs that we're going through at the moment, all of the amazing sort of interactions that we have with bacteria. So I sort of took that program and turned it into a book, basically, which was the first book that I'd written that was a popular science book. So that was a book called The Life of Poo, which explains sort of our relationship with bacteria. And one of the things that came out of that book was the sort of the fact that our modern lifestyle is really kind of at odds, if you like, with our evolved animal-like being, right? We are basically animals, and we evolved against a natural background, and the modern world and our modern lifestyle is sort of a clash with it. And I started getting really interested in the idea of stress, and I started pitching the idea of writing a follow-up book on stress. And at the time, lots of people were writing books on stress, and having seen some of them, they wrote much better books on stress than I would have done. So I started trying to expand the idea, and that's really where Unfit for Purpose came about. It's an exploration of different aspects of our life, which are affected by our modern lifestyle, but which are clashes with our evolutionary past. And you can find quite a lot of those sort of echoes, those evolutionary echoes in the ways that we deal with them or don't deal with some of the issues, which, I mean, once I started thinking about this and getting into it, wide ranging, right? There's, I mean, everything from obesity to fake news, how we think about the future, violence, drug addiction, gut bacteria come up again, of course, stress, various other things. So it just became this great way to engage with an awful lot of science, which absolutely appeals to me because, you know, I like to find out about all these things and get involved with them. So it was a great project from that regard.
And I think, you know, all the areas that you've touched on are so topical. Like you're talking about fake news, obviously, in it, which I would never think of a book where the focus is evolution and think about fake news and the kind of fake news climate that we're in now and link it to social media and even things like the obesity crisis that we have at the minute. So I loved how topical it was. And before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of some of the questions, do you want to read us an extract of the book?
Yes, I thought what I'd do is read the beginning of chapter 7, which is an unusually violent species. So
Brilliant.
this chapter kind of explores the problem of violence in the modern world and where that fits with our evolutionary heritage, where that fits with our phylogeny, with our relationship to other species as well. So I thought I'd just read the opening part of that chapter. Okay. It's always a bit embarrassing when authors read their own books, so apologies for this. At least it's not poetry though, right?
Exactly, that would be much more awkward for me sitting here. No, I'm looking forward to it. Take it away.
All right. Violence is everywhere. Turn on the TV, even during the daytime, and you can see Magnum PI and the A-Team kicking ass as you eat your lunch. Factor in streaming services, and you can watch the latest ultra-violence, far more gruesome than the over-choreographed punch-ups found in 1980s reruns, 24/7. Go to the cinema and you'll see many blockbuster movies come with a heavy side order of cracked heads and bloodshed. Perhaps the entertainment industry, with what seems like an obsession with extreme violence, might just be mirroring real life, at least if you can believe the headlines. However you choose to consume it, the news is an endless churn of ever more sickening examples of human-on-human violence, directed against women, men, children, disabled people, minorities, pensioners. Indeed, no sector of society seems safe against the onslaught. We punch, kick, bottle, club, stab and shoot. We injure, maim, torture and kill. And we do it for revenge, to rob, to hurt, in anger, premeditated, or without any particular thought at all. All of that violence is before we factor in the horrors of war, where political motivations, religion, fear, greed, and frankly, who the hell knows what, create death tolls so large, they become the sort of horrifying statistics that magnitude and familiarity have rendered mundane. Assault, rape, bodily harm, manslaughter, murder, crimes against humanity, and even genocide dominate the headlines, while millions pay to watch organized, rules-based violence in the many fighting sports that we have devised to vent fury and raise revenue. With all the violence that surrounds us, you might be forgiven for jumping to the obvious conclusion that mankind, and here it really is appropriate to say mankind, is an inherently violent species, genetically predetermined to bust heads and spread suffering wherever we go. So that's the sort of entry to a chapter that explores really our evolutionary relationship with violence, the role of violence, which has undoubtedly proved to be useful for many in the past, how that fits in with animals. We have this rather idealized view of the natural world that really isn't borne out. There's a fantastic study that looked at conspecific killing, in other words, killing a member of your own species. Now, a lot of people think that humans are the only sort of species that do that. Utter nonsense. Within mammals, I think close to 50% of mammal species have good recorded evidence of members of the species killing another member. And the conclusion of that paper was that, in fact, probably the reason why that number's not a lot higher is that we simply haven't got around to studying it in most of the others. So sort of exploring, even against that background, now we are sort of unusually violent. We're about 7 times more violent than we would predict from our evolutionary sort of neighbors. And so trying to explore where that's come about, what the influence of sort of environment, nature and nurture and all of that kind of thing is really the focus of that chapter, which was a difficult chapter to write, actually. These are challenging issues, and issues that are very personal for a lot of people.
And quite dark issues as well. I mean, I love that we jumped right in there with a very light-hearted chapter reading, but it was one of my favourite chapters, actually. I found it absolutely fascinating. And again, thinking about the way that we have adapted in terms of our evolution, have we evolved to be violent? There are obviously, as you were saying, some benefits. There are obviously a lot of negatives to it as well. So have we evolved to be more violent? Do you feel at the minute that you're seeing more and more and more violence on the news? Are we getting more violent? Why are some of us more violent than others? Is there that kind of genetic predisposition, or as you say, can it be nature and nurture? So what's the general gist of how violent we are at the minute?
It's a very interesting question, and it's a question that I expected to come out with a fairly conclusive answer to. But in fact, you can find very, very convincing arguments that we are less violent than we used to be. You can find very, very convincing arguments that we're more violent, and you can find equally convincing arguments that we're exactly as violent. And it's quite tricky. There's some really interesting studies that have looked at things like archaeological evidence and so on, and looked at the evidence of issues of human killing and so on. The problem is, of course, all of that evidence base is quite problematic to interpret. and quite tricky. I think certainly the way that violence is portrayed in the modern world probably makes it seem like it's more likely than not. Most of us, let's be honest, although violence is out there, most of us aren't violent. And actually, there's very good evidence that we've evolved mechanisms to ameliorate any violent tendencies, because we can't function really as our strength, although you could argue in the recent situation our weakness is our social behavior. That's what really has enabled us to become the dominant species that we are. The fact that we work so well together now, you can't be doing that if every 2 minutes you're sort of losing your rag and lashing out. So there's lots of mental structures in the brain and lots of control sort of structures that have evolved to prevent that. But certainly you can put forward a very convincing and well-supported evolutionary argument that would suggest that in certain situations, violence is a useful evolutionary tool. It can settle disputes very, very quickly and very decisively. In terms of competition for resources, if let's sort of look back into, let's not look at the modern world, but let's look back into sort of the world that we would have evolved in. You can imagine one family group and another family group with a shared resource. Well, that one family group would do a lot better if the other family group weren't there sharing it. Unless there's some benefit to sharing that resource. For example, you may be able to form a bigger clan and bring down sort of larger prey if you're a hunting group, or you may be able to defend yourself against an even bigger group, right? All of these things are quite complex, but clearly at some point there will have been an advantage in eliminating competition, and we see that in the natural world and sort of outside of human society too. So there are these sort of conflicts between what would have been a benefit and what would have not, and as we became agriculture came along, we became much more social even then, and then got into sort of big city states. All of these things would have been under pressure to have been moderated in some form. So there's some really interesting evolutionary arguments. There's also some really interesting evolutionary arguments that show that we're not actually that violent. The other problem, of course, is that we're quite handily put together for violence. Sure, we don't have big teeth and claws. That's true. Although we have pretty handy teeth, as anyone that's ever been bitten by a toddler will be able to attest. But we have sort of fists. We have elbows. We have the ability to use our brains, to use our environment, to use tools, to make weapons, and so on. All of which has eased us, if you like, into becoming violent. But I came across a series of rather fascinating studies during the writing of this chapter. There's a scientist and sort of, and he's not without controversy, who's been investigating the idea that we are in some ways pre-adapted for violence. And he suggested that the buttressing of the male face, he called it the punch-proof face, and suggested that some of the adaptations we see in sort of our skulls for taking blows. He started to look at the idea that actually our hand sort of architecture and everything is to do with making fists, and experimented with that. Did an empirical study, which is admirable, by taking the arms of dead bodies and sort of that had been donated to medical science. We should stress this was all done ethically.
Just find them.
and sort of wiring them up with kind of the tendons there, and sort of making different types of fists and swinging them against dumbbells and all sorts of other things to try and see whether or not this held some weight. And when it came out, it was sort of fairly widely rubbished. But actually, even a few of the staunchest critics have sort of in subsequent work have perhaps started to suggest that maybe there's a point there. So I think we're always learning about this thing. That's one of the things I really learned from this book, is that we are us, right? We're fascinated with the world, but we're also incredibly interested in ourselves. We devote a huge amount of study to ourselves, and yet every one of these chapters actually ends up with sort of more questions than answers. Well, we don't know about a lot of these. We're still not really sure about this. It's notable that we're the most studied species, and there's a huge amount we don't know, which is, I think, quite sobering for those of us interested in the natural world, because what else is out there waiting for us?
I thought that part of the book where you talked about the study with the cadavers and using them to punch to see if humans were created to kind of have the fist as a violent mechanism. I thought that was fascinating. It was so interesting, and it really makes you think. I know you talked a little bit in the book about how that was possibly a part of one of the theories where it's just kind of an outcome or an adaptation of that happening because it's evolved for something else. But it's very, very interesting. And you mentioned there as well, obviously, about being social. And one of my favourite chapters in the book was a chapter that was focused on social media. And I found that fascinating because obviously so many people love social media and have found that have had a positive impact on their life. I feel like it's had a positive impact on my life. Met people I'd never be able to meet. Even the internet in general, we wouldn't have been able to do this without the internet, which is fantastic. But you know, our ancestors didn't have that ability. They didn't have the big social networks that we have. And you talk a little bit in the book about the kind of mismatch between our evolution and social media. So are our brains fit to cope with social media? Could our ancestors have handled it, or are our brains kind of evolving to keep up?
Well, I think our brains aren't really evolving to keep up with that, certainly at the moment. I mean, the real issue with evolution, of course, is there a genetic basis to it? That's the first thing. And then if there is, does it influence the number of offspring you leave? So if there was a sort of an amazing benefit to handling social media brilliantly, and it got you more children, and it was a genetic basis, then we might see some evolution. I think what we have is a whole bunch of evolved structures within our brain that allow us to handle social situations. And we're incredibly good at doing that. We're doing okay with this chat, for instance, but it would be much easier if I was in the studio there with you, because I would be able to pick up on your facial expressions, which I can't see at the moment. I'd be able to pick, at the moment you're about the size of my little fingernail and a little zoom window at the top, which means I can't actually read your body language either. So we're doing all right. We're pretty good at this sort of thing, but we'd be even better sort of face to face. And that's been a huge advantage. Now with social media, we're suddenly thrown into a social world that is sort of vaguely similar in a sense, right? We're meeting people, we're calling them friends, we're having chats, but it's a whole different set of rules. And we try to apply, I think, sometimes the sort of the real world rules to those social media worlds, and that can cause problems. And the other thing, of course, is once we learn one platform, we think, okay, well, we've kind of worked out how Facebook works, and then we decide, Instagram comes along, and then suddenly TikTok's up and running, and it's like as if as soon as we've learned the sort of rules, the goalposts have moved anyway. But on top of that, it's just the number of interactions that we have that seems to be problematic for some people as well. And there's this thing called the Dunbar number, which people may have heard of. It was put forward by a scientist called Robin Dunbar, who suggested that there's a sort of maximum limit for the number of people we can kind of keep track of and meaningfully interact with. And that number's around about sort of 130 to about 150. And it's been a really interesting evolution of the idea of the Dunbar number. It sort of came out, and then lots of people challenged it, and then came up with their own numbers and came up with their own thing. And I cover some of that sort of backwards and forwards in the book. But what I found really interesting is that no matter what anyone does, even if they think the Dunbar number is total rubbish and they go and do their own thing, they still come up with a number, and that number is often not that far off the Dunbar number. So there's another study that came up with a number of 450, and you think, okay, so what you're saying is there's a maximum number. We're just arguing about the details. And I think what's notable is that in the modern world, it's quite possible for us to have really very large real world networks once we factor in the different aspects of our lives. So family, friends, and work are three obvious sort of networks, and those networks tend to be quite separate. So, back in the day when our brains evolved for us to be social and we were keeping track of things, we probably only really had one group that we had to keep track of. Now, even in the real world, we've got multiple groups, and that can cause all sorts of frictions. But on top of that, we've also now got this massive virtual network, which even it's possible even for people that aren't that active on social media necessarily to fairly rapidly gain hundreds and hundreds of contacts that they actually end up being more or less in contact with in some way. I'm quite an avid Twitter user, and I get a great deal from it. But I sort of look through the people that I regularly you can get these sort of apps that show you your network, and you realize that you're keeping track of really quite large networks. You're exceeding the Dunbar number in both aspects of your life, and we still don't really know how those two real world and virtual world sort of networks interact either, and that's a problematic relationship. So we are learning. We wouldn't be having this conversation 20 years ago. Facebook only came around in sort of 2006, whenever it was. So it's a very, very rapid change, and I think that's really a key feature of many of the things in the book. Actually, it's many of the topics in the book. There's been a very rapid change, and we've created a very potent and concentrated world, and those two things together are really just leave us with problems, and people do have problems with social media. What I found interesting with it, or one of the things I found interesting with it, was that it's not clear that clearly not everyone has problems with social media. There seems to be a certain mindset and a certain way of looking at the world that doesn't help. So people that are very ruminative, for example, or that seek affirmation and confirmation from other people will find social media more complex and difficult because, of course, it's a great place for people to pile on and to be very negative, and that doesn't work for everyone. Yeah. That's for sure. And that's I think quite significant. The other thing that I found interesting was that within about 4 months of sort of Facebook coming out, there were already academic papers in the literature studying it and suggesting that it was a problem. So this idea that we might be thinking social media is a problem, that hasn't evolved slowly as social media has come about. Actually, almost from the beginning, psychologists were looking at this and going, wow, this is going to cause a problem for some people. I think that first study actually focused on young people. But yeah, I mean, we have, it's quite a ridiculous situation now. It's a bit shameful and it's distressing that my children will come back from primary school having sort of lessons on online bullying and cyberbullying. We see reports of kids, children committing suicide, the ultimate there's no evolutionary future in that, right? That's the ultimate thing. And this is children that are committing suicide because of interactions in a virtual world.
It's quite dystopian, that side of things.
Yeah, that 15 years ago didn't exist. It's a remarkable place we find ourselves in. It's an exciting place, and it's got a huge amount of potential. But equally, it is a place that is not. It's not. The theme of the book. It's not the world that we evolved in, and we're not going to evolve our way out of this either. We are going to have to think our way out of it.
Yeah, and I think, as you're saying, there are positives and negatives associated with it. It's all very experience dependent. And I think thinking about the Dunbar number and how we have kind of violated that through social media, and the fact that our ancestors likely wouldn't have had that experience. They wouldn't have had as many social meetings and things, and kind of were possibly a little bit limited by the processing power of our brain in terms of keeping up with those social contexts. But social media is, 2006 for Facebook feels recent, but in the grand scheme of things for humans, it's a very, very new thing. And another, part of the book, which is something that seems to explore quite a new phenomenon, is the bit of the book that talks about fake news, because the fake news for us has really come up in the past few years, particularly with specific politics and things. It very much feels like we're in the fake news era. Particularly with things that are happening, for example, in America at the minute, and kind of splinter apps that people have to kind of purvey of fake news and spread fake news and things like that. But is fake news something that is very specific to right now? I didn't feel like it was about in the 90s or the early noughties. Is it specific to now, or did our ancestors have any issues with fake news as well?
Yeah, well, I kind of looked into this, and there are historical incidents of fake news. So Mark Antony, going back right into the Romans, was sort of involved in fake news debacles about. He was accused of all kinds of things because of his association with Cleopatra. He was going to basically bequeath half the Roman Empire, I think, to his children, which was all sort of nonsense, and that was put about in the Senate in a famous speech. Then at the beginning of the printing press and various other things, pamphleteering became a thing, and there's a famous example of sort of fake news being put about after a Portuguese earthquake, placing the blame on all kinds of different things. So the idea of telling, I suppose, telling lies, if we put it that way, is not new. That's for sure. The ability to be able to spread those lies and to influence the world around us isn't new either. It's just what's happened now is that the ability to do that is immense. That's the thing. Technically anyone, could go onto a social media platform and spout total nonsense, and that may get no traction at all, but equally it might suddenly explode. You can see this this is the sort of randomness, isn't it, of the world. So I think the most amount of engagement I've ever had on a tweet, which was actually, I think, millions, was a photograph of a local newspaper parking story where two cars were very close together, and the story was, how on earth will this person in the red car get out or in? That was it. It was a very slow news day. It just struck me as amusing. I was like, local journalism at its best. Suddenly that went, my phone was almost melting with the number of people that thought this was great. Whereas I'll tweet something very serious about science, or some big breakthrough that someone's found about something. Nothing, right? that's the slightly scary thing about the modern sort of media landscape, is that you never really know what's going to take off. Whereas in the 60s and 70s, for example, there was a very clear news agenda, and perhaps it was being underpinned by political affiliations and so on. But generally, everyone was consuming, if you like, the same amount of news. So it may have not been entirely true, but at least everyone saw the same thing. Whereas now, I have no idea what news you watch or what you get on your thread. And that's the other thing. We get news that's curated for us now.
Yeah, we're in our own little bubbles.
Yeah, so it's that aspect of it, of course, is problematic. But underpinning all of that is our evolved sort of psychology and ways of interpreting these things. We have the halo effect is well known. So the idea that sort of one particular trait in a person, for example, if a person is good looking, we tend to think that they're also wealthy and successful. We tend to think they're more honest. If someone looks the part and they have confidence, we tend to make very quick heuristic judgments on the world, right? Which is great, because we have to, right? We can't be looking at a scene and taking in 1,000 different things. We need to look at the scene and go, oh, there's a big bear coming at me, right? We're pretty good at that sort of stuff. And so we make these shortcuts, and they are evolved mental structures. And those shortcuts are great, but they're not so great when we see if we see a very handsome man who looks the part and is dressed perhaps in a suit in what appears to be a news studio that we've grown up in, and it's got all the accoutrements of news and a rolling banner and interviews and everything. We make lots of mental associations and shortcuts that suggest that this person is trustworthy, and that's wasn't a problem when there were 3 news channels, 3 TV channels, but now anyone can set up a TV channel. Technically, I mean, you can go onto YouTube, set up a channel. We could be broadcasting anything we like. We get enough followers, then suddenly we get traction. And then suddenly we're being asked onto other news channels, no matter that what we're saying is nonsense. And really, a lot of that comes out of this sort of halo effect and the psychology of confidence. And there's some fascinating studies that have been done looking at children and gullibility. And yeah, we use the word gullible as a pejorative term, right? You always say gullible, you're believing nonsense. But of course, we have to be gullible when we're a child. We have to believe what people are telling us about the world, or we likely wouldn't survive very long. And so that sense of believing what you're told and having that belief, that is something that's very very much part of this. And that's been well studied in children. And of course, on top of that, we've got all this in-group, out-group kind of psychology. The fact that we like to belong. It's certainly of good benefit to us to be part of a group. And once we're in a group, it's good benefit for us to be seen to be part of that group and to build up group cohesion and group think. And we tend to have much more positive, if 2 people do the same bad act, if that person is in our group, we tend to think better of them than if that person is out of our group. If they do a good act, we tend to exaggerate the in-group act over the out-group act. And there's a whole sort of branch of psychology that's examined all of these kind of ways of looking and thinking about things as well. And when you sort of push all of those into the mix, that's the background that we're operating in. Yeah. And then you immerse us in the massively potent, concentrated, highly sophisticated world of online news over the last 10 years and 5 years, and you suddenly start to see the problem. And linked to that is the fact that our preferences and our underlying psychological preferences personally can be manipulated and used to expose us to news that increase our sort of in-group confirmation about this. And confirmation bias is another huge thing that goes into the mix. We have all of these weaknesses which have been strengths in the past. They build up group identity, they allow us to be social, they allow us to work together, they allow us as children to survive. But now, of course, I mean, I don't think anyone sat down and deliberately said, let's exploit these evolutionary echoes to do it. But of course they are exploited, and we see. Yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous. 10 years ago, imagine 15 years ago, we sat down and had this discussion that there was online dabbling that influenced the Brexit referendum, that influenced elections. Global elections in so-called free democracies were being influenced by people dabbling with people's online newsfeed. I mean, you used the word dystopian earlier. Well, it is, isn't it?
It's entirely dystopian, and it could be. It's so dystopian that it could probably be. It's difficult for some people to believe. But as you're saying, someone is saying things with confidence, but also people are saying things that you want to believe. And the more that they say that you want to believe and it aligns with your views, the more you're kind of going to shut your eyes to anything else, and you're going to kind of repost that or retell that story to try and get other people into your social group, you know, which is fascinating from a scientific point of view, but it's actually quite scary from a word point of view and a political point of view as well.
It is, and we also we view things in a very surface way as well, which again is useful, right? We can't, if you actually, you know, I look around me now, and I've only just really noticed these other things because I'm focusing on what I'm doing here. We have a very good attention. We're very good at prioritizing and sifting, and then there's lots of studies that have been looking at all this stuff. That's very, very useful. The problem is that can also be used against us. I do a lot of work in sort of conservation and things, and tackle some quite controversial issues, things like trophy hunting and so on. And one of the things I've really noticed with that is that lots of people will share stories that they think makes their viewpoint. So there was a paper that came out a while ago, and I was reminded of it just this morning, where the title of the paper makes it seem like the authors are against the activity. Actually, the paper is highly supportive of it and produces the evidence. The number of times I'll get people tweeting this paper to me saying, look, this paper says that what you're saying is wrong. And it's like, no, this paper actually is the paper that's one of the things that you haven't read it. Right? And that's the problem. We are in a world now where there is a huge amount of complex information available to us. We don't have the time, and in many cases, I think, don't have the skills or the inclination necessary to really dive into it. But we do have the ability, because of the way that it's presented, to get a very, very surface view.
Yes, yeah.
And then and you're absolutely right, confirmation bias is the strongest of all of those evolutionary echoes, right? And if that very surface view satisfies what we think, we build up our view even harder, and we seek more evidence for it. And it is a problem. The internet, you know, you started this sort of chat with the idea that the internet is this fantastic thing, and it is. It's a wonderful thing, but I think we haven't yet caught up with the amount of information that we can get. It's tremendous, but it's almost too much. It's the fire hose of sort of information coming at us, and I think, you know, with my other hat on as a university lecturer and sort of teacher in that regard, that is one of the things that we face now. Is, you know, you can get all this information, but how do you assess what is good information and what's not good information? And obviously confirmation bias and halo effects and all those other things come into play and can be very, very difficult.
And I think what you're saying there about, you know, seeing a little snapshot, you know, seeing a headline. I've seen so many people post headlines of things, and as you're saying, it's clear they haven't read the article, because the point that they'll take umbrage with is the opposite of what it's about, or it doesn't quite summarise, or it doesn't really support what they think it supports. And what, you know, can't have this conversation about this without mentioning COVID. Obviously, massively dividing online and things in terms of wearing a mask, social distancing, lockdown, all those things. But I don't want to talk about COVID from that point of view. I want to talk about it in terms of our evolution and our genetic makeup and our ancestors. So thinking how COVID has impacted us now, this worldwide pandemic, have the genes that we have, and the genes that we've evolved and things, have they helped or hindered us? And even our behaviours, you know, human behaviours, you know, if you are in a relationship with someone, you kiss them, that's really likely to pass on, you know, whatever. If you kind of are in a social group, you might be in quite social close contact, that's more likely to spread infection. So two kind of questions there. Are our behaviours detrimental naturally to a kind of pandemic? And also, do our genes put us more at risk of suffering from something like this?
We are perfect for respiratory disease, aren't we, when you think about it? You imagine that, and you know, the coronavirus there is sort of trapped inside, you know, bats or pangolin or whatever it is. Suddenly, it gets this wonderful opportunity to jump. It must have been rubbing his little spike proteins, this wonderful opportunity to jump to a species that, by virtue of our natural behavior and ecology and evolution, right, we are highly social. We live in massively complex, massively concentrated, massively dense social structures, particularly in global cities, and we see this trend towards global cities. So that's wonderful. That's the first thing. There's a lot of us, and we live very, very close together. Brilliant. On top of that, we love to do things like hugging and kissing and all of these very close contacts. We have this sort of social space, and people are always standing too close. Well, you know, still standing pretty close. Even people that really like a bit of social space, very few people have a natural social distance of 2 meters or whatever. So mostly we stand close together. And then, of course, we've evolved this fabulous tool, which has been such a valuable tool to us in becoming the dominant species we are, language, which means that we stand face to face with each other, spitting on each other, essentially.
Over and over again.
And that's what we do. So, I mean, tremendous way to spread respiratory diseases. On top of that, it gets into a species which has got this fabulous brain that has been able to innovate the most incredible ideas, to dream of the idea of flying. And then through our hands and our brain and our eyes working together and our social ability has managed to produce a global network of planes that gather people together from across a country, corral them in a very tight space for a very long period of time in an airport. Then they stick them onto a plane and we spread around the world. And then once we get off that plane, we disperse like sort of, ball bearings hitting the ground. And so, yeah, this is, I mean, all of these behaviors, all of which, of course, have evolutionary echoes in the evolution of our brain, the evolution of social behavior and so on, have been just an absolute perfect thing for the coronavirus.
Sitting ducks.
Absolutely. And we have a wonderful immune system, which helps us to fight this. And, that's undoubtedly helped a great deal of people. But of course, as we've seen with the mortality rate of COVID-19, it's not helping everyone. We're able to help people because of our big brains and our medical interventions and so on. But yeah, this is a serious disease, and it's something that the way that we live has absolutely been a major factor in it. But of course, it's the way that we've combated this is to give ourselves distance. We're having this conversation online. We're more or less stuck in our homes. The thing that's made us successful is now our Achilles heel, and that's the thing that we've taken away. And of course, because we've taken that away from people, we're now seeing lots of knock-on effects. Because I guess it gives you some insight into sort of caged animals and zoo animals. I've seen a lot of people make that observation. You take away a creature's ability to be able to behave and sort of interact in the way that the way that it wants to, and it makes people unhappy, and that's something that we'll be dealing with, I think, for a long time too. So. Yeah, this has been a very interesting. I mean, if we stand back from the sort of the suffering of it from a scientific perspective and from a sort of social perspective, it's been a very interesting thing to see unfold. And as we introduced the idea, fake news and things have become a problem with it too. As in fact, I mean, I've finished a book on the idea of the future and how we think about the future, and I think that links in here too. We're not very good. We're not very good at things that are happening in a few months' time. We're okay. We're hopeless for things that are going to happen sort of in several years' time. We're pretty good with what might happen next week. We are short-term creatures.
Yeah.
Creatures are short-term. Evolution doesn't care about 5 generations down the track, right? Evolution is a process that's to do with offspring right now and survival and so on. And I think that's another issue too, because many of the problems that we face are problems that affect other people. So we have to think about others rather than just ourselves. That's not how evolution generally works. And we have to think about long term rather than right now. And that's a tricky combination for us to navigate. We can, and we can do it with thought, but it's not our natural tendency necessarily.
And I think from social media you can see that it's very difficult for people to for some people to look at it as society as a whole, because some people are thinking, this is impacting my rights, having to wear a mask, this is having a big impact on me, but society as a whole isn't necessarily always our go-to. And I know obviously COVID is a big medical issue at the minute, but another medical issue that I quickly wanted to touch on is the fact that you kind of kicked the book off with one of the first chapters being this fantastic chapter called Chewing the Fat, and talked all about obesity, and obviously we're in a massive obesity crisis. And one of the things that we always hear about is, paleo diets or paleo diets, that people pronounce it differently, eat like a caveman, all those kind of things. And I found your chapter in the book about obesity and things like that fascinating. But, in terms of eating like a caveman, for people who are, we're in lockdown. I'm pretty sure everyone, like myself, is eating everything in front of them. I don't know how many Cocoa Pops Caveman had available to them, but that's all I've been eating at the minute. But is things like the paleo diet, eating like a caveman, is that something that our ancestors genuinely were evolved for, or was it, literally what was available at the time? What would be best for us to kind of combat obesity from an evolutionary point of view?
Yeah, it's this fantastic kind of conceit that somehow 20,000 years ago everyone was really healthy and it was just an amazing thing, and then we went and spoiled it all by being us. Actually, it doesn't really hold much weight. If you really go back to a sort of paleo diet, then it's pre-agricultural diet. Well, the evolution of or the development of agriculture, it's tempting to think of it as the evolution. If we were looking at another species, that's what we would call it, right? But the development of agriculture in the sort of 12,000 years ago, and it took a fair while to sort of go through to the end, that induced in us evolutionary change. It changed our anatomy. It changed the way that our teeth sort of fit in our mouths and our skull shapes and so on. It's changed the way that we can digest food. So actually, this idea of harking back to sort of 20,000 years ago, which seems to be the sort of the main moment for paleo diets, is disregards a very, very significant, probably the most significant thing that's happened to us in evolutionary terms. So that already is a little bit dodgy. There's a great sort of conceit as well that sort of man the hunter is the big idea that we're hunter gatherers and that we were out in the collecting berries and bringing down mammoths and stuff, and the reality was we were probably trying to catch frogs in ponds and eating locusts if they came around and digging up earthworms. And I imagine at certain times of the year things were pretty desperate, and at other times of the year there was probably a bumper crop. But I think the notion that we can come up with ideas. We know what people used to eat. There's all kinds of cool analytical things that you can look at in terms of isotopes and stuff to work out people's seafood, to work out how much meat people ate, probably not as much as people think, to work out sort of aspects of the diet. There's archaeological evidence to show that, but that's a very different thing from coming up with a diet plan. And even if you do come up with a diet plan, then it's not really the diet plan that's post-agricultural anyway. The basic essence is, as far as I could tell, I read a few of these things. The basic essence is you have to imagine yourself sort of 20,000 years ago, kind of naked on the plain. You're only allowed to eat what you can get hold of. So, you can't sort of have avocado oil and all this kind of stuff, and olive oil and fats and sugars. In principle, the idea of not eating processed food and high fat and high sugar food, you'll lose weight doing that. And actually, there's some very good studies that have people on paleo diets and they followed them through, and they lose weight very, very quickly in the beginning because it's a calorie restricted diet. If you take it less than you burn, you're going to lose weight. But then they level up with the regular diets, and then they generally get to a point where people are unable to follow them for a number of reasons. One, they're very difficult to follow because you have to find all kinds of things that are not that easy to come by. They're not necessarily amazingly sort of engaging as a diet. And the other thing is there seems to be a connection with quite bad diarrhea for some people, which is I think we can safely say it's not going to win you over, is it? This is an amazing diet. I've lost several pounds, but not the way I wanted. And it doesn't actually fit in with our evolutionary heritage because it forgets quite a chunk of our recent evolutionary heritage. So it's a nice idea, and certainly, I mean, I mentioned in the book that I can walk from my office when I was in my office, and for about £1 or a couple of pounds, you can basically go and buy like a massive tub of lard and a couple of bags of sugar. You've got all the energy you need for a month there, but that's not what our bodies need. And I think it's far too simple to just say, oh, we'll eat like a putative and not very well evidenced cave person and get healthy. We can eat a balanced diet. The problem with the modern world is that and it comes back to something we mentioned earlier, there's this potency and concentration. It's too easy, and we are suckers for tasty, sweet, fatty foods. It generates structures in our brain that have evolved for us to reward us when we find things like that and reward us for doing sort of good things, if you like, for our survival. Well, they kick in, and we are. We need to be careful with that because we've created a world where it's just too easy to get hold of these things.
And just before we finish up, the this is still kind of related to the food, but my favourite bit in the book was where Ireland got a little bit of a shout out, which I felt very proud about, because it was something to be proud of. I know obviously you talked about the evolutionary mismatches in terms of food that we can handle and food intolerances and those kind of things. And you talked at length about my favourite drink. You talked about milk, and the fact that, lots of humans can't handle it, and some people are intolerant, as I'm sure loads of people know, people who are lactose intolerant. And in the book, how it took us so many years for genetics to catch up to drinking milk and managing milk. And my favourite part was when you talked about the lactase persistence of adults being able to continue to drink milk into adulthood. And places like Greece maybe only had 17% lactase persistence, but Ireland had 100% lactase persistent. Was not shocked at all. Pint of milk with your dinner is entirely normal. And I just thought that was so fascinating and so interesting. And it kind of made me think, are there other foods that some parts of the world can handle and some parts of the world can't? And anytime there is something like lactose intolerant or celiac or sensitivities, is that all genetic and related to our evolution?
Well, certainly with lactose, it's a really interesting story. And I think for me, what it really highlights is that although we are a globalized world and we're connected and we think of ourselves as sort of humankind and so on, actually we exist like animal species do in populations that don't necessarily mix as freely as we think. And we can see these sort of genetic differences between groups, and we can look at them historically. We can look at the spread of genes. It's really interesting when you see papers like that, particularly when you work with non-human animals, because I'm used to seeing papers that talk about genetic populations and talk about the spread of genes through populations and sort of biogeography and things, and then you realise that of course we can do that with us, which is really, really interesting. And drinking milk is for infants. That's what happens throughout mammals. The idea of adult sort of fully grown mammals drinking milk, well, it's baby food. It's a strange thing to do, but of course we have evolved to be able to do that, and that is an evolutionary adaptation. But it's not something that's seen across the world, which I think isn't always fully understood. It's evolved hand in hand with the practice of dairying, with living with animals that can give milk, and then obviously people would have tried it and probably I think I used the phrase, but blessed were the cheesemakers, because actually making cheese from milk removes some of the problems of lactose, but gives you some of the advantages of a dairy product. It's high energy for one. It's an incredible source of all sorts of things, including calcium, actually, which is a really important component too. In terms of other intolerances, I look at gluten intolerance, which is a much more complex situation than certainly I realised that before embarking on writing that chapter. It's a really interesting situation linked to all sorts of genetic sort of underpinning, but also linked to the way that our immune system works, and linked in actually as well potentially with gut bacteria and things like that. So there's lots of these really interesting connections. I haven't come across other food intolerances, although of course we see lots of food allergies.
Yes.
And the rise of allergies, which is something I covered in my other book actually. The rise of allergies is a real thing, and it is connected to our modern life, undoubtedly. It's not quite as sort of simple, as tempting as it is. It's not quite as simple to say, well, we live these very clean lives, and that's what's caused the problem. That's called the hygiene hypothesis, and actually it doesn't really hold a lot of weight, but it sort of goes towards other hypotheses that start to bring in this idea that when we're younger, we have much less exposure to the microorganisms that we would have naturally have evolved with. And that links into teaching our immune system what's right and wrong, which of course then links into things like allergies. So there are all kinds of, I guess one of the really interesting things about sort of embarking on a project like writing this book is that it's those interconnections that you find, those new sort of connections, and the way that you go from one topic and you think, okay, and then suddenly you're thinking about the eruption of the volcano Tambora in the 1800s and how that links to things, and it was that whole mix of stuff that I found really interesting, tackling these sorts of subjects.
And there are, in the book there are so many more topics. You talk about stress, being a worrier, video games, addiction, all those things. So I would recommend that people read it, but I think we're going to have to leave it there for now, Adam. So thank you so much for having a chat with us. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
I have to say, as you'll know, Adam, I've said this so many times, but I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I thought it was fantastic. It was a really fascinating insight into who we are as humans, and it was the kind of book where you had so many moments of, whoa, this is incredible, we are really incredible, and I loved it. And as I said at the start, if you're interested, No Alibis are the official festival bookseller. They are selling it in Belfast. The link is in the chat of this event, and worldwide audiences can obviously get it at their local bookshop. Please do check out the rest of the festival. If you enjoyed the event, you can check out the programme online at nisciencefestival.com, and you can also follow the festival on social media. So it's at NISciFest, and you can use the hashtag NISF21. Also, if you want to see more of the online video content, there's going to be loads from NI Science Festival. Don't forget, you can just hit the subscribe button below the video. And I want to say a big thank you to everyone who has tuned in. I hope you've enjoyed that chat as much as I did. Thank you to the Science Festival, and a big thank you to the wonderful Adam. And please do grab your copy of Unfit for Purpose now. I'm Emer Maguire. Thank you and goodbye.